Welcome back, everyone. So, today on this explainer, we are breaking down a truly bizarre and honestly deeply unsettling firsthand account from a Halloween flight that just went entirely off the rails. If you're someone who finds it fascinating how a completely normal, everyday situation can just psychologically unravel into sheer terror, well, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to chronologically map out exactly how this traveler's night shifted from just a mundane inconvenience to a story that could barely even bring themselves to tell their own family. I want you to just think about that for a second. What would you do? We've all been there, right? Stuck at the airport, waiting on a delayed flight, maybe grabbing a stale cup of coffee. It's annoying for sure, but it's rarely actually dangerous. But what happens when the very environment that is supposed to be highly regulated and incredibly safe suddenly becomes the setting for something completely inexplicable? Well, this explainer is going to walk you through exactly how that transition happens, step by step, using the narrator's own chilling account. Let's get into it. All right, Section 1, the Halloween flight delay. Here is the setup. So it was Halloween night, and this particular flight suffered a massive delay. The airline was completely scrambling, which meant most of the passengers were actually reseated on other flights. This left just a handful of people on board, specifically, as the source points out, those who were unlucky enough not to be reseated, or the ones who simply couldn't afford to go book a hotel room and try again the next morning. Because of this massive delay, a flight that was originally scheduled during the day was shifted entirely to an overnight flight. We are setting a very specific, kind of moody scene here. A dark, nearly empty aircraft flying right in the middle of the night. Interestingly, the remaining passengers organized themselves in a very specific way in this unusually empty space. Our narrator decided to take full advantage of the situation. Because they could basically choose any open seat, they opted for a quiet corner way up in the front section of the plane. They actually described it as enjoying a luxury usually reserved for first class. Meanwhile, almost everyone else on the plane chose to cluster really closely together at the far back section of the aircraft. The narrator mentioned they missed the usual daytime window views, which forced their attention entirely inward, into the cabin itself. And that inward focus leads us right into a psychological phenomenon we really need to understand to grasp this story: cabin claustrophobia. Even though modern airplanes can look surprisingly large on the inside, the enclosed space and that underlying knowledge that you literally cannot leave created a persistent, nagging discomfort for our narrator. They noted this constant need for distraction, like burying themselves in a book or listening to music, just to cope with this subtle background anxiety. Actually, they were just about to pull out their phone to distract themselves when the normalcy of this flight abruptly came to an end. Which brings us to Section 2, a morbid cabin discovery, the eerie silence. First, a flight attendant suddenly approaches our isolated narrator up in the front and asks them to move to the back. Being pretty confused but traveling light, the narrator just agrees to this highly unusual request without asking any questions at all. They figured there must be a perfectly logical reason. But as they noted in the source material, they deeply regretted not asking why when they had the chance. Because almost immediately after they settle into their new seat in the back, the entire cabin plunges into this heavy, eerie silence. The normal, everyday chatter of those clustered passengers instantly dissolved into these frightened, hushed whispers of shock and disbelief. The narrator described the sudden shift in the room's energy with a very specific, honestly chilling observation. They said, "Have you ever felt that strange sensation of the atmosphere around you instantly becoming heavy with sorrow and the thought I've never been cheerful again?" That is exactly what it felt like in that cabin. The air was literally sucked out of the room, and as the narrator looked around to see what was causing such overwhelming dread, well, they found out exactly why they had been asked to move. They were sharing that small, enclosed cabin with a dead person. I mean, talk about the worst possible seating upgrade, right? The flight crew was likely just following standard, albeit totally morbid, aviation procedures for dealing with a deceased passenger mid-flight by moving them, or in this case, moving the living passengers away. But logic doesn't stop human instinct. The narrator's stomach began actively churning. The notion of being trapped in this metal tube, flying through the pitch black on Halloween night, and sharing the air with a corpse, it was entirely too much to process. Now we hit Section 3, the restroom terror and seeking refuge. So a crucial point here is how the brain handles panic. The narrator retreats to the restroom, just needing to take a breather, to basically tell themselves to get a grip. But consider the deep irony of this contrast. Outside, they are dealing with the stark reality of a corpse. But inside that tiny, locked restroom, a completely different type of fear sets in. They are completely isolated, They ironically noted that they suddenly felt less safe locked in that tiny space alone than they did outside in the cabin with the rest of the living passengers. They were just starting to calm their elevated breathing when, boom, a massive, violent, loud thud shakes the restroom door. Out of absolutely nowhere, just as they were pulling themselves together, something physically hits the door with incredible force. And then, complete silence. The banging stops instantly. There is nothing but the sound of their own panicked breathing. They end up waiting a few terrifying minutes in this tiny box before mustering up the courage to cautiously peer through the gap in the door, preparing to make a run for it. Moving into Section 4, the suspicious flight attendant. Bizarre behavior. As the narrator discreetly steps out, fully expecting to see a threat, they notice some incredibly bizarre behavioral clues. First, the exact same flight attendant from earlier appears completely out of nowhere, almost hitting the narrator with a beverage service trolley. Second, and maybe most bizarrely, she appears entirely oblivious to the deafening, violent banging that had just shaken the door moments prior. I mean, how could she not have heard it? And third, she didn't say a single word. She just gave the narrator a weird stare. You know, the kind of stare you give someone when you highly suspect they are onto you. The narrator immediately broke eye contact as she coldly continued pushing her cart down the aisle. Now, this next detail is just fascinating from a psychological perspective. The narrator was so profoundly shaken, so utterly distracted by the unexplained banging and the bizarre behavior of the flight attendant that they hurried back to their seat and literally walked right past the dead body. They completely forgot about the corpse seated in the corner right behind them. It just shows that the human brain can only process so much terror at once, and the immediate, unexplained threat of whatever hit that door completely overwrote the morbid reality of the deceased passenger. Finally, Section 5. A lingering Halloween mystery. The unresolved threads. Once safely back in their seat, the narrator started heavily doubting their own senses. First of all, none of the other passengers in that silent, tense cabin seemed to have heard the loud banging either. This led the narrator to question themselves. Was the thud actually as loud as they remembered? Or did the claustrophobia and the proximity to death just amplify a totally normal plane noise? Ultimately, they kind of rationalized it. It was Halloween night after all. Maybe it was just an incredibly ill-timed prank. They actually ended up using this experience as a spooky story for their young nephews back home, but purposely withheld the entire terrifying truth of what really happened on that overnight flight. Which leaves us with a pretty chilling unknown to wrap up this explainer. Was it really just the cabin pressure, the overwhelming stress, and maybe an elaborate Halloween prank by a strangely silent flight attendant? Or did something much more sinister happen right outside that restroom door at 30,000 feet? The terrifying uncertainty of being trapped in the sky, completely enclosed with a mystery you cannot escape, is exactly what makes this account so gripping. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning what you see, and until next time, stay curious.